And I think the relevant thing for me is that I run a conference every year, and others of us run conferences every year, and they're academic conferences. And they are discussions among ourselves to some extent. And they, to some extent, extend the discussions we have among ourselves in the professional literature, the journals that we publish in. But the differentiating feature of this exercise for me is that it's the first real grassroots endeavour that has come from the community. And I'm just old enough to go back and identify the lineage of this event, the Vietnam protest teach-ins that were the starting point, as I know, of the community resistance to something that they didn't feel they had a voice in opposing the government policy of the day. And my country had a foreign policy in that period which was summarised by all the way with LBJ. And it took our boys, in those days mostly boys, into Vietnam with great loss as well. And it was the teach-ins here and the mass street marches in Australia that stopped our governments being involved in that endeavour. And what I learned from that historically was that it's community action that ultimately will stop things like that people see they have no voice in. They eventually get a voice by banding together. Because the top end of town have got their voice, it's called the money. And I'm sure if we go over to Peter Peterson's session, we would see it as a fairly sumptuous event. They've got the money, they've got the contacts, that's the nature of political lobbying. Alternative views that we represent don't have any of that, never have had, and they rely ultimately on groundswell of public opinion. And I see this event as a starting in that sense. If I think back a couple of years ago, we'd had maybe in different countries different lengths of this, but say in Australia we'd had 25 years of growing neoliberal, what's now known as neoliberal thinking, which I characterise it by the abandonment of full employment by our governments, the introduction of a diminished social goal which I call full employability, that is a supply side, the OECD job study agenda of making people ready for jobs just in case there was a job, but not actually providing jobs. Whereas under the full employment agenda, governments provided the jobs, or made sure they were provided by using aggregate demand management in the post-war period up until about the mid-1970s. And we'd had 25 odd years of this sort of privatisations, deregulations and what have you. And then this crisis comes along, and I thought at that stage that this was the sort of event that might generate a paradigm change in our thinking, a return of fiscal policy, because with it I thought, well, this is a chance. Now 2 years later, fiscal policy has saved the world from the Great Depression, no doubt about that. It's, in my view, demolished everything you'll read in modern mainstream macroeconomic textbooks about the efficacy of different types of macro policy, monetary and fiscal policy. Yet 2 years later, after the handouts have been gratefully received by the top end of town, after we've put some sort of floor into the downward spiral, not as enough of a floor because the fiscal reaction hasn't been sufficient, but 2 years later we've now seen this mass hysteria which almost defies logic to me, that this daily barrage of financial data and I call it ratio fever. We've completely lost track of what's happened, and we're basically setting ourselves up again for the next crash.